All right. Good evening. I'll go ahead and get started. So let's start by generating a altruistic motivation for our time, thinking of the material for the course being the Buddha's teachings on wisdom. So just taking a moment to focus our mind on our own need to develop our wisdom, the benefits that would flow from that for oneself. And then particularly thinking of the ways in which being able to benefit from greater wisdom would permit us to be of greater and greater benefit to others. And thinking that that's the real purpose of our time. All right. So we are on chapter 16 in the material, and we're kind of right back to pretty dense material, which is relatively common in this text. Chapter 16 is called Testing Your Realization. And what His Holiness is going to be explaining in this chapter are the, kind of the levels at which we might develop some insight into this topic. And how do we distinguish what level of insight we are at? Because in a way, this topic is also covered in tenets, Buddhist topic on what's called tenets, where different systems of understanding, different ways that this concept has been understood historically are taught, and they present a person with increasingly subtle ways of understanding the topic. And so His Holiness is kind of getting at that same point, that we may develop some insight, but it may not be the subtlest insight. And so we can try to recognize what level of insight we've developed, and then recognize, not that we, that means that we're not done, that we can go even subtler in our understanding. So he gives us a kind of test that we can use to distinguish between a coarse and a subtle understanding of the emptiness of oneself. So he advises that if in meditation we go through the analysis, the 4-point analysis, and then we start to see through the ego identity as being set up under its own power. By engaging in that analysis, if we get some sort of sense of that groundlessness, then what he advises is that we switch the object of our meditation or analysis from that object of refutation that we've been talking about, where you cause the I, you use a memory of the I asserting itself quite strongly, and then you look for what might be responsible for giving rise to that experience. We may have some success in seeing through that experience of the I when we've taken that the I as it appears in those sorts of memories to be our object to be refuted. But if we remain at that level, or if we take that experience of seeing through that ego identity as the end goal of practice, His Holiness is indicating that we may have only reached a course level understanding of what we are trying to do. So his advice is that it's good if we start to see through that self-supporting, what he calls self-instituting identity. But then we can check and we can, instead of analyzing that ego identity, move our focus to the body, or even just a part of the body. And then he says, if you sense that your body or arm, as an example, is, I wonder if that's a typo. If you sense that your body or arm is self-instituting, no, it should be if your sense that your body or arm is self-instituting immediately vanishes. That's not what it says, but I think it's a typo, which is weird. What it says is if you sense that your body or arm is self-instituting immediately vanishes. But grammatically, I don't think that's right. Anyway, point is that if you move your analysis into, for example, your arm, and then due to the force of your insight, you start to relate to your arm as not being set up from its own side, as also being empty, essentially, then you can take that as a sign that you are understanding the nature of emptiness in a subtle way. But he says, however, if the force of your previous reasoning does not immediately apply to your body or your arm or your foot or whatever you take, then this shows that your understanding of the emptiness of the quote I is not so deep, but is on a coarser level. So in a way, to me, I kind of, if we were to use like a car as an analogy, then in one way, intellectually, kind of on that course level, we can think, okay, well, yes, it's true that I'm relating to this object through, a label, and it doesn't really have that label. But then when we look at the steering wheel, we're like, oh, but the steering wheel really exists, like the parts really, they're really there. It's just, the coming together of those parts kind of, you can see, well, arbitrarily or through mental imputation, when those parts come together, um, yes, it's true that I'm ascribing a label to that's kind of above those parts. But it's harder to recognize that the steering wheel and the tire and the seat cushion and the clock and the dashboard and the windows and the roof, that all of those individual parts are also empty of inherent existence. So in a way, I think that's kind of the distinction, that if we were to try to apply it to something else, I think that's kind of, if our insight is quite strong, then when we do look at the steering wheel, instantly it will also appear to be empty of inherent existence. But if we're like, oh yeah, car is a made up concept, its independence upon its parts, I've labeled it. But then when I look at those parts, they still seem to have their own independent existence, then that is an indication that we haven't really deeply understood this concept. I don't understand this concept at all. So I can only, go by what His Holiness is. His Holiness is the one teaching this class. He has directly realized emptiness, and he's giving us this advice. He's giving me this advice, too. And the way that I'm understanding it is how I've explained. So then the second subsection of the chapter, how to tell the difference between coarse and subtle misconceptions, he also goes on to say that this is kind of something that we've touched on before, that when we identify the object to be refuted, we can't always and forever rely on how we are starting out. We're starting out with memories that are, relatively kind of intense, memories of fear or embarrassment or indignation, the things that we've discussed. And those are relatively strong experiences of the I. And that's how you start. But His Holiness is also pointing out that we can't rely on that forever, because that object of refutation is not is an example of the I under certain conditions. But the I, as we've addressed, in previous classes, the false view of inherent existence pervades our experience, even when the I is more dormant, is less sort of loud, like when we're, as we've said, kind of just driving a car, reading a book, we're still under the influence. It's not like we're suddenly free of that misconception. So the object to be refuted, as we progress in our understanding and our meditations, we need to begin to use subtler manifestations of the object to be refuted. And if we only stick with those really intense, really loud versions of the I, then we might think, well, the I is only that the false I only arises when I'm like that. And the rest of the time, there's no problem. The rest of the time, I'm seeing things clearly. But when I get really worked up, then I start to see things in a false way. And that's not true. We see things falsely all of the time. It's just at the beginning, it's easier to use those examples as an entryway into the topic, but we have to progress. Okay. Any thoughts or questions so far? So His Holiness just continues then in chapter 16. The subsection on persistence is needed. He's basically just encouraging us then to identify these subtler and subtler appearances of the I, and then continue to analyze them using the 4-point analysis as we did with the course versions of the I. He says, when you advance toward understanding that people and things cannot be found under analysis, but take to mind that they do indeed exist, you may begin to feel the impact of the statement that they exist through the power of thought. This, in turn, will challenge you to consider further how people and things appear to your mind, and will undermine your confidence in the goodness or badness of these appearances, which you automatically accepted as intrinsic to the objects. You'll begin to notice how you assent to the appearance of objects and how you latch onto them. So like we've said before, when we observe objects, we label them instantly as positive or negative. Not always, could be positive one day and negative the next day. It doesn't mean that we always see it the same way over the course of our whole lifetime. But each time we cognize, at that moment, it appears positive or negative or enjoyable or aversive, what have you. And then we think that that is inherent to the object itself, as if a pleasant object is made out of happiness and an aversive object is made out of suffering. But His Holiness is saying that we'll begin to recognize what we are bringing to that act of cognition, what filters we are using that are layering that projection of mind, that categorization on top of the sensory data that we're observing in the object, and that it is not intrinsic to the object. It is something that the mind is adding to the object. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? On chapter 17 is just like one page. Here he's talking about that idea, that false understanding of ownership, that the idea that when we misperceive, we use statements like my body, my mind, um, and that um, and that that conventionally speaking, we talk that way, and we do have a sense of personal agency, and so conventionally, it makes sense. um, he says, although it cannot be denied that each, the body and mind, performs its respective functions, still there is no independent I, separate from body and mind, that owns these. Your ears, eyes, and so forth are indeed objects that you rightly in a conventional sense, see as quote unquote mine, mine, but they do not exist in the way they so forcefully appear to your mind to be owned by an inherently existent quote unquote I. Again, like Venerable Rabina says, it's unnecessary. She uses the way of talking that there is body, there is mind, there is body, there is mind, but to say my body or my mind is an unnecessary addition or elaboration of what is true. Body does what body does, mind does what mind does. They're performing their functions and they are associated, but we don't need this idea of an owner that is layered on top of body and mind. There's just two interrelated phenomena that are both capable of performing their own unique functions. So things can function and yet still be empty of inherent existence. And then in chapter 18, His Holiness goes back to the meditative foundation, which is calm abiding, and then special insight, which so insight is anything, we use the word insight, I mean, like, I understand this topic, better or more deeply than I used to. I've had a deeper insight. Special insight, though, only arises in the mind of a meditator who's developed fully qualified calm abiding. So now, prior to having cultivated calm abiding, we might meditate on emptiness and we might gain some insight into the topic. But with respect to all of the Lamrim topics, a meditator who meditates on that topic with fully qualified calm abiding will develop what's called special insight, which, because fully qualified calm abiding is a uniquely powerful, stable, concentrated, penetrative kind of mind, it's like having a microscope that goes to 100 rather than 10. And so when you resolve that topic using your average 10 powered mind, you get a picture of the topic. But when you resolve that topic with the 100 power calm abiding mind, you have a picture that's much different, much more detailed, much more accurate, much more precise, much more valid. All of the fuzzy areas, and they're completely eliminated, and you have a true picture of what's there. And this applies to the insight into impermanence, into death, into guru devotion. I mean, all of these insights benefit tremendously from developing calm abiding and then using calm abiding to meditate on that topic. But for this particular insight, the real difference is that in order to have a direct, non-conceptual realization of emptiness, a person is required to have developed fully qualified calm abiding. You cannot fully realize this topic in a way that leads to enlightenment without having developed fully qualified calm abiding. But he talks also about how special insight is needed in addition to just calm abiding, because a person, can develop either, fully qualified calm abiding itself, or they can go on to develop the jhanas, the form and formless realm absorptions. And sometimes, sometimes in some traditions, Hindu traditions and things, that might be most of what they do or all of what they do. And a person can mistake those absorptions for a realization that, for a really powerful spiritual realization. And I mean, it is, but it doesn't really lead to liberation. It's not really a liberating insight, but they can mistake it as such because in that meditative equipoise, all of the afflictions are temporarily suppressed. A person in meditative equipoise on calm abiding, even if they're just kind of all they've done is just withdrawn, just remained in the absorption itself, with not having taken emptiness as an object or anything, they really can't give rise to hatred or jealousy or any of the afflicted states. So it's a very tranquil, the mind is so peaceful and so calm and so tranquil when you're in meditative equipoise. But then you have to arise from that from time to time. And if you only remain in the absorption because you're like, well, I really enjoyed not experiencing those afflicted states for those however long I was meditating, so I'm just going to keep doing that over and over again, you're not developing special insight. You're not using the mind of calm abiding to focus on wisdom realizing emptiness. And so you're not truly putting an end to the afflictions. You're just entering states of mind temporarily where those afflictions can't arise. But then you leave that state, you go back to your daily life, and now all of the afflictions are flooding back. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, quick question. I think it is the same, but I just want to confirm, calm abiding and meditative equipoise are the same?
No.
Okay.
A person can develop calm abiding, then fully qualified calm abiding, but they may not have entered and be absorbed into that state. So but they are still a person who's developed the ability to, at all times, they've become someone who has realized fully qualified calm abiding. When they then enter into that absorption during the length of that session, they are in meditative equipoise, and that can either just be in the absorption, or if they've taken emptiness, or if they've taken an analytical topic as their object, then they would be said to be in meditative equipoise on wisdom realizing emptiness, or what have you. So it is the meditation session where they are absorbed in fully qualified calm abiding, not just the fact that they have realized fully qualified calm abiding. But maybe that was not what you were
No, that's what I'm
implying.
asking.
But,
No,
yeah.
no, that clarifies. Thank you.
So what His Holiness is now encouraging us then is to recognize the importance of using calm abiding to generate special insight. And so this is called the union of calm abiding and special insight, where for a meditator at this level, previously, the analysis that, previously, before fully qualified calm abiding, there anything that agitated the mind or increased, a person wasn't, wasn't really able to maintain calm abiding while engaging in analysis, because the analysis itself interfered with the absorption, because it's we've talked about how that is intentional discursiveness. And so up to a point, intentional discursiveness is an obstacle to the absorption into fully qualified calm abiding. So a person would only be actually experiencing calm abiding when they were focused on the object, but not engaging in any analysis. But now, with fully qualified calm abiding, the meditator can move between those two states of analysis and stability, and the analysis itself does not interfere with the absorption, on that they're able to maintain meditative equipoise both during the active discursive period and the stabilizing period. And at this point, he says, earlier, when reading and thinking about emptiness, your consciousness was aimed at emptiness as an intellectual object of inquiry. So your mind and emptiness were separate and distinct. But now you have the experience of penetrating emptiness without the sense that subject and object are distant from each other. You are approaching a state in which insight and emptiness are like water being poured into water. Gradually, the remaining subtle sense of subject and object vanishes, with subject and object entirely merging in total non-conceptuality. He quotes the Buddha, who says, when the fire of knowing reality just as it is arises from correct analysis itself, the wood of conceptuality is burned like the fire of sticks rubbed together. So again, not, this kind of instruction for someone who's realized fully qualified calm abiding, but it's just kind of explaining more about how the process unfolds at that point, that that we need to use calm abiding to, once that tool is part of our toolbox, we need to then apply it to analytical meditations on the wisdom realizing emptiness, and probably all the other realizations of the path too, but really, you know in particular, wisdom realizing emptiness, because then the we'll be able to get to a point where the mind becomes so skilled and so flexible that even engaging in that 4-point analysis, actively dissecting the body, the mind, the body and the mind, going through all of these, even doing that only reinforces our ability to remain in that meditative equipoise, on the 9th level of fully qualified calm abiding. So in chapter 19, he starts to talk about how things appear to this person who has this, potentially direct, non-conceptual view, or maybe at least a correct inferential understanding. It's hard to say exactly what, but he says, as a result of your having investigated the nature of the eye and other phenomena, you now know that they appear to exist inherently, but you understand that they are empty of inherent existence, just as an illusion conjured up by a magician does not exist the way that it seems. So this is a common example that they give, if this idea of like a magician's illusion, where if you go to a show and you don't know the magician, you've not been there before, and they're able to create some sort of incredibly lifelike, realistic, three-dimensional projection of like a horse on the stage. You might not, seeing it for the first time, not really knowing anything about what was done, it might appear to you that there's genuinely a real live horse on that stage in that moment. That's kind of like not investigating how the eye appears. There's just an extremely convincing hologram or illusion that's being done, and you're fully tricked by it. You're fully under the influence of that. But if you work with that magician, if you are his assistant and he or she shows you, well, there's this mirror and there's this machine that has these lasers, and they walk you through all of the steps. Now it's still, however, still true that when you go back into the audience, there's no real difference between how that appears to you. And, it's still just as the colors are the same, the size is the same, the shape, all of what the information coming in to your senses is the same as it was before, but now you're armed with all of the wisdom of understanding what has created that experience. So you're no longer tricked by it. It hasn't changed. It hasn't become something else. It isn't like you are able to not see it. But although you are seeing it and it is still looking like a real horse, your mind is able to distinguish that and say, no, I can see how it looks like that, but I know because I've analyzed it, I've I've broken down exactly all of the things that have given rise to this. So I know absolutely that it appears to be something, but it is actually just an illusion. There is no real horse there.
I'm going to comment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this is a common theme for me, that sense of things being unreal, the magicalness. Intellectually, all right, yep, I get it. If I become the sorcerer's apprentice, to use that metaphor, then I'll be okay. I'll understand the secrets. But until then, I feel very uncomfortable looking out at having my sensory experiences and having assumed for all of my life that this was what was really happening. And this is the way it is. Just that sense of being so disconcerted. Yeah. Intellectually, I can override it. Emotionally, I have not been able to override that discomfort. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like with this class and with others similarly, where emptiness is discussed, that I feel like I'm making progress, right? I hope. But it's still a persistent reaction that I have to this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. So then His Holiness in the next chapter, he is encouraging us to see the benefits of this kind of analysis. He says, seeing people and things as existing like illusions helps reduce unfavorable emotions, because lust, hatred, and so forth stem from our superimposing qualities on phenomena beyond what they actually have. For instance, he says, when we get very angry at someone, we have a strong sense of the wretchedness of that person. But later, when we calm down and look at the same person, we may find our earlier perception laughable. The benefit of insight is that it prevents us from attributing to objects a goodness or badness beyond what is actually there. This undermining of self-deception makes it possible to reduce and eventually end lust and hatred, since these emotions are built on exaggerations. This elimination of unhealthy emotions in turn leaves more room for healthy emotions and virtues to develop. By viewing phenomena with insight, you bring them within the scope of the practice of emptiness. So in chapter 20, he's hammering home with, so we've talked about when we say that something is empty of inherent existence, we mean that it is a dependent arising, because it does not exist inherently from its own side, set up under its own power. It does exist as a dependent arising, and the three things that it depends upon are causes and conditions, which is two things, but they're kind of lumped together: causes and conditions, parts, and then an act of mental imputation. And that third one is really, I think we've said, before, that of the three, the third one is the kind of most important, because we can concretize the first two. But the third one is where we recognize that it is our own mind that is labeling or designating the thing that we are observing, and that act of designation is what generates that label, and then that label appears, reflected back to us to be that which owns all of the parts, all of the causes and conditions, all of the attributes. So it's really that most important step is the act of mental designation. He says, consider a time when you felt intense hatred or desire. The hated or desired person or thing seemed extremely substantial, even totally unchanging, didn't it? When you look closely, you will understand that there is no way to claim that you already see phenomena as dependent on thought. You will find that they seem to exist in their own right. He says a coiled rope's speckled color and coiled form are similar to those of a snake, but when the rope is perceived in a dim area, the thought arises, this is a snake. As for the rope at that time, when it is seen to be a snake, the collection and parts of the rope are not even in the slightest way a snake. Therefore, that snake is merely set up by conceptuality. In the same way, when the thought I arises in dependence upon body and mind, nothing within mind and body, neither the collection that is a continuum of earlier and later moments, nor the collection of the parts at one time, nor the separate parts, nor the continuum of any of the separate parts, is in even the slightest way the I. Also, there is not even the slightest something that is a different entity from mind and body that is apprehendable as the I. Consequently, the I is merely set up by conceptuality in dependence upon body and mind. It is not established by way of its own entity. He says, it seems in the end, the meaning of the world's being established by conceptual thought is that objects, without depending upon a consciousness, cannot establish their existence right within themselves. From this viewpoint, it is said that the world, all phenomena, both persons and things, is set up by conceptual thought. For instance, he says it is obvious that effects depend upon causes, but causes also, in a subtle sense, depend upon effects. Every cause itself is an effect of its own causes which preceded it, and therefore arises in dependence upon its respective causes. And then he talks about how causes are designated upon the effects. You can't say that something is a cause unless you're aware that there was an effect that resulted from the cause. You can't say that I am the doer of a, you know, an essay being written unless you're aware that there was an essay that was written. And so the person is the doer, the cause of the essay, but the existence of the essay is required to establish that the person created the essay. So in this way, cause and effect are linked, they are interdependent. Um, He says, if something exists by way of its own entity, what would be the need for being posited dependently? Indeed, if such a thing existed in itself, that alone would be sufficient. You could just say, it is this, without needing to relate it to anything else. Because it is not established in and of itself, there is no alternative but to posit it in relation to something else. So a person is, like, or you could say a dog is not a cat. If a dog was just inherently a dog in and of itself, you wouldn't need, you wouldn't, it would just be broadcast. There would be an essence, but we kind of arrive at dog by what dog isn't. A dog is not a cat, it's not a camel, it's not a horse. It has a particular collection of causes and conditions and parts, but they are arrived at and designated as dog because, and only because, they are distinct from cat and mouse and elephant and car. There are a class of causes and conditions that you can distinguish from any other class of causes and conditions and parts. And being a unique class of causes, conditions, and parts gives rise to the designation, but that only makes sense in relation to all of the things that it's set against, that you are indicating that it is other than. Um, and we wouldn't need to do that if it existed, if dog existed in an impossible way, set up from its own side, without um, being designated, without um, having any relationality to anything else. If it was just intrinsically, inherently a true essence of something, um, it wouldn't need, there would be no comparative analysis that we would need to do to establish what it is that we're relating to. Um, but that's an impossible way for anything to exist. And so we can recognize that we arrive at that class due to our understanding of other classes of causes and conditions and parts. Um, So now in the last section of the book, His Holiness goes into a different kind of direction, where he's talking about love and compassion. And so chapter 21 is called Feeling Empathy. So he points out that that there's a relationship between love and compassion, and insight and wisdom, because from the Buddhist perspective, love is the wish for oneself and all sentient beings to be happy and to be free of suffering, and to be happy and have the causes of happiness. Compassion is the wish for oneself, to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. And these are valid minds. These arise, these states of mind are able to arise when we are simply in touch with what is true. They're not biased minds, they're not partial minds, partial meaning like skewed in one direction or another irrationally. They don't depend upon having a concretized view of self or other. So we can use wisdom to, and we should, His Holiness is suggesting that it's important to also not be satisfied with love and compassion that is limited, that we, the kind of love and compassion that we might have at present for a select group of people or animals that we're close to, that we feel have benefited us, that kind of emotional love and compassion needs to be expanded. And we use wisdom to do that by understanding the nature of suffering, and by understanding the causes of suffering. So really, we can use insight into the Four Noble Truths to deepen the extent to which we spontaneously and naturally wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be free of suffering and its causes, and to have happiness and its causes. So he explains that he goes through this 6-point analysis of the sort of existential condition of all sentient beings that we can use to deepen our love and compassion. So the first is, just as the bucket is bound by a rope, so beings are constrained by counterproductive emotions and actions driven by them. Just as the movement of the bucket up and down the well is run by an operator, so the process of cyclic existence is run by an untamed mind, specifically through mistakenly believing that a self exists inherently, and then mistaking the nature of, quote, mine, unquote. 3, just as the bucket travels up and down the well over and over, so sentient beings ceaselessly wander in the great well of cyclic existence from the uppermost states of temporary happiness to the lowest states of temporary pain. 4, just as it takes great exertion to draw the bucket up, but it descends easily, so beings have to expend great effort to draw themselves upward to a happier life, but easily descend into painful situations. 5, just as a bucket does not determine its own movements, so the factors involved in shaping a person's life are the results of past ignorance, attachment, and grasping. In the present, these same factors are continually creating more problems for our future lives, like waves in the ocean. And 6, just as the bucket bumps against the walls of the well when it ascends and descends, so sentient beings are battered day by the suffering of pain and change, and by being caught in processes beyond their control. So, like I said, the wish for oneself and all sentient beings to be happy and to be free of suffering is a valid state of mind. It's a state of mind that arises when you see things clearly, as opposed to jealousy and envy and hatred and lust and all of which depend upon seeing things in an exaggerated way, seeing things in a way that are different than how they actually appear. But these 6 contemplations are a description of how to, you don't have to think of those sentient beings as inherently existent sentient beings, just that there is body, there is mind, there are experiences, and those experiences are can be described using this analysis, using this way of thinking, and that all sentient beings who don't exist inherently but do exist are going through experiences as being described like this. And when you engage in that reflection, the wish for at least oneself, uh, and arises, and then you just have to use that, in a gradually more and more expansive way by, engaging in other contemplations, to, use oneself as a proxy for the spontaneous wish for oneself to be free of love and to be free of suffering and its causes, and to have happiness in its causes, and then just extending that subjective experience outward in ever increasing larger groups, larger ways. But this contemplation at least can give rise to that experience, and then you can just use that subjective experience and kind of force yourself in a way to relate to sentient beings for whom you don't naturally, easily, spontaneously relate to in that way. Strangers, people that are difficult, people that you feel like are causing harm to oneself or others. When you start to recognize their existential condition as the same as one's own, and that their suffering for them is just as intense as one's own suffering is for oneself. And there's a variety of other contemplations, but it says, if your mind has not been affected by thinking about the way you yourself wander in an uncontrolled cycle of self-ruin, then when you reflect on the process of suffering of other sentient beings, you will not find their suffering so unbearable that you would need to help extricate them from this morass. So he's, again, encouraging us to use oneself as the as relating this to ourselves, and then recognize that this is my existential condition and become deeply affected by that. And unless we start with that and we develop a strong wish for, to do something about our own suffering and our own happiness, then we'll never be able to relate to the suffering of others in a way that would cause us to be deeply motivated to also do something about their condition. So he's saying, we begin with oneself with regard to this description of our existential condition. So then he says, when we extend this to others, we have to join it with, if we're going to then extend that insight into what we're experiencing to others, we also have to join it with a sense of closeness to them. He says, otherwise, the more you know about your enemy's suffering, for example, the happier you might be. So we might delight, if we only have an understanding of suffering, we still might delight when that suffering is occurring to people that we feel like ought to be suffering. He says, therefore, it is essential that you generate a sense of strong cherishing and affection for sentient beings, all sentient beings, because only then is your understanding of their suffering going to motivate you to do something about that suffering. So he says that true love and compassion arise on the basis of respecting others. This feeling of empathy is achieved by recognizing that you and all others share a central aspiration by wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, even if you view happiness and suffering differently. So here, it's the common point that His Holiness always raises of recognizing that the differences between oneself and others are superficial, but in essence, I want to be free of suffering and to be happy just as intensely as every other sentient being wants to be free of suffering and wants to be happy. And I have no claim to being able to accomplish that is superior to the claim of any other sentient being. We all have an equal desire and we all have an equal right to accomplish that. He says also it helps to be aware that over the course of countless lifetimes, everyone has been your mother and your closest friend. So, again, this is the point of recollecting the kindness of others. So we may feel like, oh, that person hasn't been kind to us as far as we can remember in this life, but over countless past lives, they have been, extremely kind. They have given up their lives to protect us countless times in previous past lives. And so the more that we recollect that, the more top of mind that way of relating to them will be. And the more likely we are, just like when we observe someone in our close family in a dangerous situation or undergoing a difficulty or an obstacle, and the way that they have kindly related to us is very top of mind, our willingness to act for their benefit would also be more effortless. If we can cause that to be true with respect to all sentient beings, then that same willingness to work for their benefit will also be just as effortless. Yeah. Okay. I think that's probably enough. I'll probably want to do one more class, but I think that's enough for today. Because His Holiness moves into impermanence and other things. Um, there's only, how much more is there? Oh, not much more. Well, I don't know. We have 15 minutes. I just haven't prepped this far into the book. Let's see. So, chapter 22. His Holiness talks about impermanence, and so he talks about the illusion of permanence, which is the idea that maybe we've touched on, the false view of permanence, is the not something that we would say out loud, but kind of the idea that we hold in our minds subjectively, that death, even though we would say to people, I won't live forever, I will die, it, that event is always a future event. And that even when we're quite ill, even when we have a diagnosis of terminal, whatever it might be, we don't ever wake up with the view, today I definitely will die, or today I almost certainly will die. It's always, well, yeah, next week, maybe in a month. So even, and without that, of course, it's, well, yes, decades and decades and decades from now. And that's a completely made up view. We could certainly die in the next few minutes. There's no reason to think that we won't. There, of the 8 billion people alive at this moment, in 10 minutes, some of them aren't going to be alive. And that could certainly be us. There's no sense that it's a thing that happens. To say that it's statistically improbable has no predictive power on the individual level. Statistical probability is only useful on a population scale. But given that it happens to individuals within the population, we are an individual in the population. And so there's no reason to think that we will wake up tomorrow, that we will be alive in an hour. He says this mistaken belief puts us in great danger of wasting our lives in procrastination, which is especially wasteful when our lives are blessed with the leisure and opportunities to engage in productive practices. To counteract this, it is important to meditate on impermanence. The first, that the fact that death might come at any moment, and then on the very momentary nature of our lives. One of the chief reasons, he says, desire and hatred arise is that we're overly attached to the current flow of life. We have a sense that it will last forever, and with that sort of attitude, we become fixated on superficialities, material possessions, and temporary friends and situations. To overcome this ignorance, you need to reflect on the fact that a day is coming when you will not be here. He says, even though there is no certainty that you will die tonight, when you cultivate an awareness of death, you appreciate that you could die tonight. With this attitude, if there is something you can do that will help in both this life and the next, you will give it precedence over something that would help only this life in a superficial way. Furthermore, by being uncertain about when death will come, you will refrain from doing something that would harm both your present and future lifetimes. You'll be motivated to develop outlooks that act as antidotes to the various forms of untamed mind. Then, whether you live a day, a week, a month, or a year, that time will be meaningful because your thoughts and actions will be based on what is beneficial in the long run. By contrast, he says, when you come under the influence of the illusion of permanence and spend your time on matters that go no deeper than the surface of this life, you sustain great loss. He says, for one who cannot face even the word death, never mind the reality of it, the actual arrival of death is likely to bring great discomfort and fear. But those who are accustomed to reflecting on the imminence of death are prepared to face death with no regret. Reflecting on the uncertainty of the time of death develops a mind that is peaceful, disciplined, and virtuous, because it is dwelling on more than the superficial stuff of this short lifetime. So then the last chapter is called Absorbing Yourself in Ultimate Love. And he says, now we turn to the most profound level of love and compassion, which is made possible by knowledge of the emptiness of inherent existence. And he quotes Chandrakirti, who says, I offer homage to loving concern, viewing transmigrators as empty of inherent existence, though they appear to exist inherently as a reflection of the moon in water. He says you can use this metaphor as a way to develop insight into how we are unnecessarily drawn into suffering by assenting to false appearances, thereby falling prey to lust and hatred and all the actions that stem from them, accumulating karma and being born over and over again in a cycle of pain. This insight will stimulate profound love and compassion because you will vividly see how unnecessarily all these ills are. So he's talking about the reflection of the moon in water, as if, when you look at a still lake, it's as if there's the moon actually there. And then, there's these stories about, well, you might try to catch it, or you might try to, because you're caught up in that, and it's just a reflection. There's no actual moon there, and that's um, the mistake that all of us are making about assenting to the false appearances. And when we assent to the false appearances, we get caught up in as if we can grasp the moon in the lake, as if we can actually possess happiness and be free of suffering by craving and grasping things, objects that appear to be made out of happiness, or rejecting objects that appear to be made out of suffering. We have this false view that we can truly be happy by pushing and pulling because we've assented to the false appearance of the objects. And when we spend our lives doing that, as he says, we create negative karma, and we're just trapped in a cycle of suffering. Um, he says, here sentient beings are seen not only as suffering in a sixfold process like a bucket in a well, but as imbued with momentary impermanence like a shimmering, and as imbued with momentary impermanence like a shimmering reflection, but also as subject to the ignorance of going along with the false appearance of inherent existence. With this fresh insight in your mind, great love and great compassion arise in you for all sentient beings. You feel close to them because they want happiness and not suffering just as you do. And you feel the impact of their having been your closest friends over the course of countless lifetimes, sustaining you with kindness. To gain access to this depth of love and compassion, it is necessary first to understand that you yourself and other sentient beings are empty of inherent existence. He says, all problematic emotions derive from the basic destructive emotion and ignorant consciousness that both does not know how persons and things actually are and actively misconstrues their nature. We should see destructive emotions as enemies, uh, first identifying them and then engaging in techniques to destroy them. Driven by afflictive emotions, we engage in actions that establish counterproductive tendencies in the mind. These actions result in rebirth in unhappier lives, and virtuous actions result in rebirth in happier lives. Both stem from vast ignorance, however. Through directly realizing the truth and becoming accustomed to it in meditation, you will stop accumulating karma that drives your rebirth in cyclic existence. Rebirth will come under your own power to direct it in order to help others more effectively. Since cyclic existence is rooted in the misapprehension of inherent existence, the only way out is recognizing this fallacy for what it is. Although there are many factors, he says, producing cyclic existence only at its root, ignorance, can it be severed? For this is the source of all other causes. Through the meditative reflections in this book, you've learned how to cultivate antidotes to those causes, to put an end to suffering and the causes of suffering. When you internalize this process, you generate an intention to achieve liberation with more than just words. He says, by understanding emptiness, you realize that it is possible to break free from your own entrapment in cyclic existence, which makes firm your resolve to leave cyclic existence. When you understand that the suffering of others is also induced by ignorance, you realize that it is possible for them to free themselves from all suffering, strengthening your decision to help others. In this way, insight makes love and compassion realistic expressions of deep knowledge. As Buddha said, the Buddha's compassion for sentient beings is generated through contemplating, quote, whereas all phenomena are empty, sentient beings cling to views of inherent existence. Understanding that beings are empty of inherent existence, you develop even more profound love and compassion by holistically seeing how they bring suffering on themselves through ignorance of the nature of people and other phenomena. Realizing the emptiness of inherent existence opens the way to enhance love and compassion. And that is the end of the book. Any thoughts or questions? No, we went through that last section quickly.